Now we should see.
It says step home, because it,
Huh?
I already pressed it.
Yeah, all right. We got the green line. That's important. That
Which
means
green?
we're streaming now. Evening, Scott.
Hey, hi.
All right. I had the option of having either one very long talk or two short ones, and I have decided to do two short ones. I guess I'm showing my age. I've been doing these talks now for more than 50 years, and it's been very much of an evolutionary process. I can remember the very first talk I ever gave. It was to a small group in a chapel service, and I read the talk rather than spoke it. And because of that, there was no spontaneity. There was, it wasn't live. It was sort of, you've all been in places where people read papers or, if they're going to read it, they might as well not do it. So, but at any rate, there was enough originality in that first talk so that it wasn't a disaster. It was a matter of I knew what I wanted to say, and I stuck with it. I stayed with the original plan and went all the way through. And in this, I was a young man. I was shivering in my boots, worried. I had never done any public speaking or anything like that. So if it was liked or disliked, I wouldn't have known from feedback. And shortly after that, I guess maybe within a year, I moved back to Wisconsin here. And I got started with the Free University, and I started giving talks, and it was the late 60s and the early 70s. And the attendance in the talks was very large, and it was enthusiastic. It was maybe 100 people in a class. But most of the people were strangers, which made it difficult. In the evolution of doing these talks, I learned that there was more communicated if there was a rapport with the audience. And I eventually found out that the audience is as important as I am, because it's really an interaction. And I learned that if I was deeply familiar with the material, and I could ad-lib, and if the crowd was large, it was like playing a great big pipe organ. And the different people in the group were like the different stops. You pulled a different stop and different things came out. And it was really fun. But things changed, and I changed. Everything is like that. And as the times changed, fewer and fewer people were interested in mysticism and spiritual astrology. And the change with myself is that I didn't want to do only just broad beginning things. And I wanted to do more subtle things and deeper things and go into things more. And in that, I learned that working with smaller groups, there's more interaction and you develop a sense of intimacy, and the smaller group is more likely attuned to what you're trying to do in the first place. And so it became very easy to share in this way. And that's been the state of things for several years now. The fact that I got used to speaking in a rapport was obvious a few weeks ago. Several young people came in for the talk, and most of them were unfamiliar with mysticism, and I struggled. I struggled because I was trying to communicate with new people and trying to instantaneously develop a rapport, and it didn't, I wasn't familiar, and it didn't work out really well. Now I'm finding that the change in the evolution is continuing. This year we started streaming to the internet. And since we've been doing that, there are a whole bunch of new problems. And, and attendance is declining. It's at the point where I don't even want to answer the phone or look at the email on the night of a class. Already 2 of them came in tonight saying they're not coming, and another one's in New Orleans, so he isn't going to be coming. So the attendance in person has been declining, but there has been an increase in people over the internet. And this is messy for me. It's not nice at all. It's not a cozy nest, and it's not with a group of well-known friends. And so it's almost ironically like the first talk I ever gave. Not only is the attendance small like it was then, it is with talking to most of the people over the internet, it is like I'm talking to the world. And I don't know for certain who my audience is. And so I have to do that same thing. I have to say what I want to say, whether there's interaction with the audience or not. So that's the way things are. And there is definitely not feedback, and you can't develop a rapport. At least I can't develop a rapport with people all over the world in the moment. So it's a struggle, and I'm trying to adapt, and I probably will adapt. But the prospect of this continuing to the point where there will be just me and a camera is not pleasant to me. It's not a pleasant prospect at all. But one thing has come out of this, and that's both pleasant and unpleasant. And I have come to the conclusion that if people who see and hear the talk over the internet send me emails, I'm not going to answer questions by email because it's too much personal attention. However, if some of the questions that come in by email are germane to what we're trying to do in the class, I'll include them in the material as we go along. And that is the case with this evening's talk. I received an email asking me several questions as a result of the last 2 talks, especially the one immediately preceding this one. And the questions made me realize that there were some things that I hadn't covered. We're still in the desire world after death, and we're spending time in both the lower desire world and the higher desire world, and I think we have at least 1 more talk left before we finish that, and maybe 2. So the questions that came in led me to talk about 2 different kinds of examples of things that happen in the post-mortem existence in the desire world. And both of them are about a matter that is so deep and so difficult that it is probably beyond my understanding and ability to speak to in my present state of evolution. And that subject is freedom. And it touches on a theological issue that is so difficult for contemporary theologists that many contemporary theologists have become atheists. The theologians see it as a problem of evil. It can be stated in several ways and is stated in several ways. And one of them is the question, why is there evil? And the theologists put forth different statements about it, different answers. One is that God has an evil side just as much as God has a good side, and that those two things are necessary to the totality of God. And that is an idea that you wouldn't know good unless there were evil. That is, again, one of those polarities that I don't like at all. I like comparatives. The fact that something is good means that there can be something better. The fact that there is good does not necessarily mean that there is evil. At any rate, this is the thesis put forth by Carl Jung in his book called Answer to Job. And he takes what he understands from psychology and extrapolates it into theology, and he ends up with a really absurd book. I think probably by now he's probably ashamed of it. Another answer to that question is, well, maybe God's not omnipotent, and that there is a force of evil that God does not have the capacity to control. Assuming that it is God's duty to control, which is what some people, even theologians, believe. That's a question that's open. Another answer to that question is there is no God, and that good and evil are just descriptions of forces active in the world, and that we describe them according to our background. It's almost like sociology. But that's the way they look at it. Now, none of these options are really very pleasing, especially to minds that are attuned exclusively to the physical world. This is all they see. And so that's not a very pleasant view of the cosmos. Now, I have a friend who took courses at the university in theology. And the theologians in the university are not tied to a doctrine or are not tied to a church, and they can be more rigorous about questions like this. Because if you're teaching theology in a church and you're making a new priest or a new minister or something like that, you sometimes hedge your bets. You don't talk about it. And that doesn't happen in a university. And a friend told me that most of the theologians that he encountered were atheists because they didn't believe that God, if there was a God, was good, and that God was good, would allow holocausts and other horrendous things that human beings do. Now, mystics see this whole business very differently. It is seen by Christian mystics as a matter of freedom. It is that we are co-creators, and we are endowed with creative freedom at every level of creation. Nothing is off limits to us. Nothing is banned. We have that story in the Garden of Eden that don't eat of the fruit of knowledge, of the tree of the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, but it wasn't banned. So in our freedom, we took that option. Basically, it means that we took the free option of going against the creation if we so choose. Even though the creation is a beautiful, sublimely wonderful thing, we don't have to go along with it if we don't want to. So this means that in this respect, we have some equality even with the Creator. However, when we take creative action, any action that we take, any time we initiate a new cause, that cause is going to have a consequence. So it's subject to the principle of action, but so is the Creator. As long as things are in spirit, it's fine. But as soon as things are put into some form of manifestation, as soon as action is taken, then what happens is that even the Creator is subject to the principle of cause and consequence. In this, mystics have a great advantage over materialistic theologists because they can see a greater reality and they can see beyond physical existence. So just imagine beholding the beauty and the grandeur and the wonderfulness of creation. If you do that, it would seem utterly stupid to separate yourself and work against it. And ultimately, it's a much different subject from this evening's talk, but ultimately, what is called evil really is stupid. All right. When we work in concord with love and we are divine co-creators, it is an ecstatic process. It seems almost unthinkable to want to work outside of it, and especially to work against it. Yet, that happened. We were beguiled. We were beguiled in innocence and in ignorance, and we did that very thing. We worked outside of divine intent. Now, the part of this that I'm not really certain about is if it is ab initio. That is, was it there from the very beginning? If you think about our participation in the great creation, did we, as monads or virgin spirits or whatever you want to call us in that state, did we freely choose to participate? Or were we chosen and agreed? That's a very hard question to answer. I can't answer that. Because I think when you're talking about that level or that state of spirituality where there is a unity that goes way beyond anything that we can currently conceive of in our consciousness, the question may not even be asked that way. But we can look at the question in another way. We can ask, can a person demit or drop out of the creation? Again, when you're at that level, it doesn't make any sense because we are all part of the one universal spirit. And the one universal spirit can't not be. We may not participate, but we can't not be. So my opinion at this point about whether people can drop out of the creation or out of the grand process that we are part of is almost impossible. Because the nature of spirit is that it gives. And when it gives with its entire being. Because it is one. It is a unity. It can't make less of itself. So, it gives, and it gives fully. I even believe that the divine plan, the creative dream, whatever you want to call it, cannot be realized unless the universal spirit and every focus within the universal spirit gives its all. You have to give yourself totally to the creation in order to realize it. In any case, it seems that ab initio, that is from the beginning, that once the spirit is given, it is given. Now, by the principle of analogy, this principle of spiritual giving, of spiritual commitment, is manifest on all levels. That's the way things are with the principle of analogy, as above, so below. I don't know if I did remember it. The Bible states it one way. It says, let your yeas be yeas. Psychologists state it another way, and they say that one of the cornerstones of psychological health is follow through. When you start something, you follow through. Now, we're studying the human life cycle, the cycle of rebirth, and it is on that level of the cycle of rebirth that we want to look at this. When a spirit comes to rebirth, it is volitional. It has a destiny because of past actions and inactions, but when it comes to birth, it's in spirit. And when it is in spirit and it comes to birth, the spirit always, its yeas are yeas, and it gives itself to the process. It's said that some have minor inklings of something like personality in the spirit and might be mildly reluctant about coming to rebirth, but I'm not certain that I believe in that. However, once a spirit, a threefold self, makes a decision, it does so, and it does so with gusto. As much gusto as it can muster from past experiences, because that's the nature of spirit. That gusto could be called creative enthusiasm, but most usually it is called the will to live. Now, eventually we're going to look at this process of when we begin to come back to rebirth in detail, but for now, let's just say it happens. Now, things here in the three-dimensional world, in the chemical, physical world, things here are very different from the conditions in spirit when the decision was made to come to rebirth. There are more limitations here. There are many, many more limitations here. In fact, limitation is one of the purposes for our life here. Most of us here are blind to direct recognition of the higher spiritual worlds, and a lot of people are even philosophically blind to a higher purpose. And some personalities, because of past experiences, are not strong. So some here on earth choose to express their freedom by opting out of participation in this world. We call that suicide. Suicide is indeed an act of freedom. Dostoevsky, who writes very beautifully on that subject, realized that. He understood that. He even thought that suicide was a divine act because it went against all natural instincts, all laws of nature. But he also saw, at least eventually, that it was a petty personal act and that it was kind of foolish relative to life with a capital L. At least to my knowledge, and I read most of what he wrote, he didn't come to the conclusion that it is an act of freedom to consciously and volitionally work with life, to work within the law, not as an automaton, but in full consciousness and in full dedication as we give ourselves to anything that we love. Life doesn't just happen. Life is lived. And the more freely and the more intent that we are about giving ourselves to life, the richer life is for us. And that is the thing that Dostoevsky never had a chance to come to, I guess. Anyway, suicide is an act of freedom. But it isn't an act made with full consciousness of the consequences. A lot of the things that we do, we don't have a full realization of the consequences of them. And it's certainly not done with the gusto of the spirit at the time of the decision to come to rebirth. So when a spirit makes the decision to come to rebirth, a very complicated process ensues. And this will be an abbreviated statement of it. The spirit is transcendental. And rebirth and the process of the rest of the life cycle is phenomenal. It's concrete. And since the mind is the closest concretion to the spirit, all phenomenal activities begin with the mind. The concrete mind is the means used by the spirit to create all of the other vehicles of consciousness. And it is through the concrete mind that the spirit enters into those vehicles and functions from within them. We didn't have that link of mind between the personality and the spirituality. The spirit couldn't enter and function from within. We'd sort of be like the animals being guided from without by an external spirit. So the first thing when coming to rebirth that the spirit does is puts forth a thought for the coming life, as far as the spirit is capable of thinking it out. Because all of the concrete worlds have an element of unknownness about them. It can't be all thought out, or there'd be no reason to come to birth at all. Now, since the world of thought is as close to the universal spirit as the personality can get and still be concrete, this thinking or thought process is a shared process. And our lives are not a vacuum. We interact with other people, and other people have big influences on us, even in petty little things, like border disputes or things of that kind of nature. So the thought is shared. And our lives, as much as we think with regard to the other person. If we love somebody deeply and we're committed to them and have been for many lives, when we plan our life with them in mind. And they have a right to say something about what our life is going to be. This same initial thought is also the thought that is behind the creation of all of our other vehicles. Not only the mind itself, but the desire nature and the etheric nature and the dense physical nature. All of that is in that initial thought of what a life is going to be. And those bodies and the circumstances of the life that are being planned out depend on past experiences that have been brought to ripeness and creative experiments or creative tryings of new things. Now, this very complicated thought, which is a creative thought because it activates everything else, is called an archetype. And that thought is infused with spiritual life. And it is set spinning, so to speak, by the will to live, which is a spiritual impulse to outward expression. So, this archetype activates all of the other vehicles and controls quite a bit of our life. Some of our life is spontaneously developed along the way, but the major things that we are to be experiencing in this life are pre-planned in the archetype. All right, now we're ready to examine what happens in a suicide. In the suicide, take a pistol or hang yourself or do whatever, the dense physical body is incapacitated. And with no dense physical body, the lower ethers of the vital body are also of no use. But we're still conscious in the higher ethers. And we're conscious in all of the higher vehicles. Because the will to live has not been deactivated. It is a divine activity that is not directly affected by concrete activities, only indirectly. So the will to live is still active. Now in this, it's something like firing a pistol. You have free choice until you fire the pistol. And once that bullet is set in motion, it can't be done. It can't be undone. And consequences come out of that, whether you like it or not. Now, this is something that's a bit subtle and something that's very powerful. Every creature around us strives to live. We mow the grass and it comes back. We see any creature, any animal striving to live, and it'll strive to live under the most hostile conditions imaginable. That's an expression of the will to live. But in those cases, it's the group spirit, not the individual spirit that is functioning within, that causes the will to live. Now, because the thoughts and desires and vital nature are still active, the spirit, the will to live, is still wanting to work through them, but it can't. It can't bring the impulse of the will to live in this world to fruition. It's all blocked. You know, it's not even, the word block isn't even the right word. It just isn't there. So this is described by people who can associate their consciousness with other people and experience what those people are experiencing as an aching. It's not like the cut of a wound, and it's not like a sorrow, but it's a deep existential ache. it is the will to live, is an undeniable force that is behind our deepest and strongest aspirations. Now, when this happens, it's not a punishment. Punishment is a human conception. The divine doesn't do that. This is just what happens if you cut off the ability of the Spirit to manifest itself in the world. It's a consequence that you have to live through, just like any other consequence that you've made. At the same time, when there's not only this ache in the fundamental will to be, the will to live, there is the desires are active. You still have desire impulses of things you want to do, because the archetype for the desire body hasn't run out either. The thoughts, the very thoughts that we injected into our life that are going to be the main thoughts in life, are still active. You know that thoughts are born when the mind is born, that some of the thoughts, in fact the most important thoughts that we have in life, are made before we come to birth. And they usually come ripe at the same time that the mind comes ripe. That most genius thoughts in most fields of endeavor occur between age 24 and 25. That's the mean time when the creative thoughts come to fruition. So, the Spirit can see to some extent what's going on in the world, not in the same way as if it had eyes, but it knows what's going on, and they can get a rough idea of what they've done to other people, and the Spirit can get a rough idea of what its life would have been like if it had not committed suicide. So the whole business is a tremendously frustrating ache. And you're in a state of powerlessness. You'd like to do something, but you can't. And that is a terrible frustration. And this lasts as long as the life would have lasted if it had not been terminated by suicide. Now, the consequences of this are really sad. You think, like a lot of teenagers commit suicide. And if they're over 14, if the desire body has been born and the second self is with it, imagine if that teenager that just committed suicide was going to live until 80. Can you imagine what a deep impression that would make on the spirit? The consequences of this kind of experience are extremely deep. One becomes aware of the divine will like never before. Now, reliable clairvoyants find that in the next rebirth, someone who has committed suicide hangs on to life desperately, sometimes overly cautious. And it goes beyond that. This has etched so deeply into the soul, but the soul isn't completely intelligent and informed about what happens. Now, in ancient societies, like in Rome, it was considered acceptable and even a noble thing to commit suicide under some circumstances. So there were a lot of suicides, and consequently, there were a lot of people who were desperately clinging to physical life. Now, Max Heindel claims that in many cases, when suicides die in their next rebirth, when they find themselves dying in the succeeding rebirth, they panic because, oh my goodness, I'm going to be without a body again. And he said that very often, until people were more enlightened, they would jump into an animal's body, and they would lock themselves into an animal's body. And his claim is that some of the early clairvoyants, in trying to understand this, because it was so prevalent, was what came up with the whole idea of the doctrine of the transmigration of souls. That someone would die and enter into an animal's body, and when that animal would die, they would still be panicked, and they would jump into another animal, and this is where the doctrine of transmigration of souls comes from. I can't substantiate that. I think it's worthy of consideration, especially since you could read out of the memory of nature. Of course, there are other meanings to transmigrations of souls which have nothing to do with suicide, and probably not even much to do with animals as animals. They have to do with the evolution of consciousness, and the stages of consciousness are represented by various different animals. In any case, suicide is all about a short-sighted expression of freedom, and an expression of freedom that is made in ignorance. It's a continuation of the fall of humanity in that regard. It has deep and dire and long-term consequences. All right, that's our first example. We're going to be just under an hour, I guess. Now, the second example of post-mortem life in the desire world has roots deep within the creation. The idea, as we stated in the Judeo-Christian context, is that we as humans have a unique freedom. It is a freedom that is not experienced by any other of the divine hierarchies, angels, archangels, thrones, powers, dominions, archai, whatever. They don't have the same kind of freedom that we have. This freedom is not only unique, it is a little bit ironic. Now, stated as simply as I can state it, which is probably too brief, we gained our freedom by acting independently, outside of the divine plan, and outside of the intent of the divine plan. We're again talking about the fall here. And we did this by acting in ignorance and in innocence. But if you're a divine being, it doesn't make any difference. It's just like you go to the traffic court and you say, I didn't know that was the law. And the judge will tell you, ignorance is no excuse for the law. You're still subject to it whether you realize it or not. So, if we say this another way, we can say that we came into our divinity by breaking divine law. We came into our divinity by becoming renegades. And we came into our divinity by sinning. Now, we can't act without activating the principle of action, cause and consequence. And we have suffered. And this suffering is more than just pain and agony. It is pain and agony and humility to a divine being. And humility before everything else in the creation, in our self-consciousness. Now, most of us, if we're interested in active mysticism, are children of fire. And as children of fire, we feel this unique freedom is well worth all the suffering. It's worth every bit of it because it gives us the potential of this very special becoming. Now, the beautiful thing about this is that when in Christ, which thinks about more than the self, thinks about the others and the all, when we intentionally and with full knowledge work within the law and the divine plan, we are much better creators than we would have been if we hadn't rebelled and if we hadn't fallen. So we are living out, eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And it's good provided that we don't persist in our folly and provided we aren't stubborn rebels. Now, someone who does what is called good, not because they are some divine automaton, but that they know that they are doing it good, and they're doing good and doing it in freedom, this is the very best way of service and giving that you can have. Now, there's much more about this that could be said, but it's too much for now. Now, the free choice to not act in accord with the shared divine intent was not a once-only situation. It occurs all the time, and it occurs on many different levels. We just saw it as it happens in suicide. It has continued from the very first instances, and it will continue until we are thoroughly convicted in a living way of free choice within the divine plan. Now, in short, we continue to act selfishly and suffer until we understand the freedom of grace of working lovingly within the all. It doesn't take anything away from us to work lovingly within all. We don't have any individuality or ego or anything else to protect to do that. Now, the irony in all of this is that some freedom and some new creations are still being born in our sins, which bind us in destiny. We're doing new things, and they're not all beautiful new things. For example, if someone murders another person who was not intended to die, then what would be called a random homicide, it is a free creative act. And it produces a completely new destiny and not just a continuation of anything that's been before. That's one of those ironies about the kind of freedom we have bought for ourselves. But in order to understand this, we need to clarify what an unintended or a random homicide is. And without a well-trained clairvoyance and a thorough knowledge of cause and consequence, that's not an easy thing to do. We all know for certain that there are intentional murders. People hold grudges and they seek vengeance, and sometimes that vengeance will last over several rebirths, and it will be right within the lives of the people that are in that kind of a vengeance feud. Then there are potential murders. Murders which are possible within the archetype if both the murderer and the murdered follow certain lines of development. See, our lives aren't all completely written for us. Much of our destiny is contingent on what we do and what we don't do, even the time and the manner of our death. We all know that if we went out and ate all kinds of junk food and did things like that, we would be shortening our lives. If we didn't take care of our bodies, our time of death would be different than if we had. And the same is true if someone has the potential of a murder in their archetype, as they start hanging out with the wrong people and they get involved with a life of crime, and they put themselves in a situation that that potential becomes an actuality. Planned murders are easy to see, and the others are not, especially the random variety of murder, which is extremely rare. Now, in the Parkland shooting in Florida, it's likely that there was some semi-intentional, if not completely intentional, murder. Perhaps that kid didn't like some of the teachers or didn't like some of the other kids and had murderous thoughts in mind. That murderer is, as we said in the talk previous to this, egged on by somebody from the other side, somebody who has a vengeance against society, and that happens frequently. Now, all too frequently in our society. Recently, we had this Las Vegas sniper. That's a much different kind of mass murderer than somebody going to his old school and shooting it up. It has a quality or the potential of randomness within it. So a non-contingent murder, or what we're calling a random homicide, was possible. Now, with unintended murders, it's nearly impossible to tell before the fact of the murder itself. But after the fact, they're easy to spot. And that's because the unintended murder victim is in a situation that is almost identical to the suicide. In the other types of murder, the intentional or the semi-intentional, the archetype had a flaw or it had run out or something like that, and that was the end of the person's life. But in an unintended or random murder, the archetype and the will to live driving it is still very much alive. It's still active. So the victim suffers, and the suffering is not voluntary. And it's not the victim's doing. So there is a great destiny that the murderer of unintended victims has built for himself or herself. What happens when a person is an unintended homicide victim is that if they can be spotted or if they can be found in the inner worlds, the invisible helpers, who are inner world servants among both the living and the dead and the various hierarchies, come to assistance. And as I understand it, it is, my understanding is not always direct and firsthand. I can bring very little back from the other side. The victim is placed in some kind of spiritual anesthesia. I don't know how this is done, but there are people who have miraculous powers well beyond my own self. That I'm like a little kid before that. And so they're put in this state, and they stay that way until the archetype has run out. How they get the lost experience, I don't know. But these are just examples, two more examples of things in the lower desire world this time that are indications of how things function and the kind of things that can happen after death because of the way we have lived while we are here. I myself am in awe of people who can do these kinds of seemingly miraculous spiritual acts that it is, you say, wow. You feel like, what have I done in life? I've learned very little as far as being able to spiritually help. Now, hopefully, these two examples should be enough to illustrate some more features of the lower desire world and what happens as a consequence of things that we do in life and what the purgatorial consequence of them is. Now, what's left for us to do is to understand the process of all the things that we've looked into, how it works in the desire world, both in what is called purgatory and hell, and in first heaven. And to understand that process is what we're going to do. We're getting at the whole idea of why these things occur, and we'll do that in the next talk, and it may take us 2 talks. That's all I have for tonight. Questions? Do you know about the Sunday morning service? Good, maybe we'll see you. That's it, Dale. It didn't crash, did it?